Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and around the world. For this half hour, I would like to kind of bring updates once again to sort of education within Texas. This time we're going to be focusing in Austin. We heard from Rachel Tucker a couple weeks back about sort of the state of education down in San Antonio, and I'm so glad to be talking about it once again in Austin this time, where the show is based. So we're going to be talking about again like various education issues that kind of forcing or attempt to force children back into classrooms, and what sort of impact that has, and sort of what's being done, and sort of the response of teachers and teachers unions to that. So to talk about all this, we are joined once again by Ken Zarifis, who's the president of Education Austin. Thank you very much, Ken, for coming on the show once again.
Brianna, it's really a pleasure to be back. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be speaking with you again. I want to kind of start this off by reading a short statement on sort of the January 25th guidance from Education Austin. This was posted on social media and to the website, I believe, earlier today. And it states, it states, we are frustrated and disheartened to see Austin ISD pushing for students to return to campus on January 25th, especially in light of the incredibly dire situation we remain in and record-breaking hospitalizations and positivity rates in our country, which is still at stage 5, in our county, rather. We encourage leaders and members to work with their colleagues and administrators to create a flexible staffing plan. Principals have been advised by district officials to, quote, continue to work with staff to ensure they have a student-centered plan at each campus, unquote. Since most students continue to learn remotely, it makes sense to have flexible staffing plans that allow remote work for as many staff members as possible and reduce staff counts at each site. We also continue to call on the district to work closely with Austin Public Health and Travis County to maximize efforts to procure needed vaccinations to our faculty and staff. So, a bit of a kind of dire note there, Ken. Can you tell us what's going on with AISD? What exactly is the situation at the moment?
Well, Brianna, the last week and a half, the schools, or a couple weeks, the schools were lowering their numbers. They had called home and said that they were encouraging, not requiring, but encouraging families to keep their kids home. The city had hit stage 5. Really, it's the worst point in the whole pandemic. In almost a year, we knew that the hospital rates, transmission rates, death rates, everything was peaking. And so we were encouraged, and there was a collective sigh, really, from a lot of employees to gain greater flexibility, which is what we've been fighting for since October and before, to gain flexibility to meet the needs of students and grown-ups alike, to keep everybody safe. As the district, for whatever reasons, felt that it was important to encourage people to come back, while we're still in stage 5, it really runs counter to what they were saying about stage 5 just a week ago. That they wanted the flexibility, they wanted campus to work directly with the teachers and employees, and to keep the kids safe. And we saw the numbers that were already low. Only 22% of students were going to campus anyway prior to a couple of weeks ago, and now we've seen a drop even in that. And we find that that's the right thing to do, right? It's keeping people safe. You keep fewer people on campus, more people are safe, fewer people are sick. But then in Austin, AISD's infinite wisdom, when everything's going in the right direction, but still at stage 5, they go back to what business was like 2 weeks ago. And it's really frustrating for us to see this seesawing back and forth. We're going to do this. No, we're going to do that. Instead of staying consistent to keep safety number one. I just think that compliance is the priority over compassion in AISD.
Yeah, when you say compliance over compassion, really compliance with what and why? Like, what exactly is it that's at stake regarding kind of forcing children back into classrooms that I think many people would look at it and say that there's kind of no safe way to prevent the the spread of COVID at this point? Like what really is what is the priority there? Why are they so focused on getting kids back in classroom, do you think?
Well, they'll point their finger at TEA, and I point my finger and I throw my finger up at TEA many a times. And so the Texas Education Association runs, oversees all schools in the state of Texas. And Mike Morath, the commissioner, is hell bent on getting everybody back in schools. He just doesn't care. And so, yes, he leans in on the districts. And I would have to say that Austin has been as good as any urban district in the state in terms of keeping people out of school and keeping people safe. I will say that. But that's within the state of Texas. That context is not a very, I don't want to be compared to the rest of Texas.
That's a very low bar.
We can do a whole lot better. There's a yeah, I can step over that bar very easily. And so it's not, there's a lot of flexibility that the district abdicates through this process that they could be utilizing. My daddy used to say, be careful about pointing your finger at me, son, because you got three pointing back at you. Hold yourself accountable for what you can do. And that's exactly what Dr. Elizalde has been doing, has been pointing at GEA when she can create flexibility for staffing. So we want the district to be looking at what are the students on a campus. We've got a campus right now that this week had 41 kids on the campus. 41, one of the largest middle schools in the city. They had 4 times that many grown-ups they were requiring to come back at least one day a week. So you're going to expose over 100 people to the campus and to adults just for the sake that you're going to hold everybody equal and have everybody there, rather than really doing the hard work of seeing who really wants to be here, who doesn't, what are the kids that are here, do we want to require them to be here, not be here? There's no analysis of what the needs are and what the resources are to meet those needs. If you do that, you then have a greater flexibility. You don't need everybody on campus, and some people can be teaching from home and be teaching virtually. But our administration thinks, well, I can't say you can stay home and you have to go in. That all has to be equal. Well, it just completely runs in the face of all their equity talk. Equity is not equality. You don't treat everybody the same. These are people that have health issues, that have serious issues. Annie Dragu, a theater teacher at Austin High, cancer, heart disease, was denied the second round of accommodations, was forced to go back into school 2 weeks ago, was there 3 days, ended up with a viral infection in the ER in a life-threatening situation. People had to be on the verge of death for us to get them out of the classroom and teaching virtually. It should never take that. And that's what we're seeing. We need greater flexibility. The district's just kowtowing. They could be more flexible. They're just being obstinate because they want everybody to follow their rules, do what they say.
Yeah, I'm actually I have worked a little bit with again Rachel Tucker, who was on the show a couple weeks back on an article for Liberation News on sort of the situation across Texas schools, and this mirrors what's going on in so much of the state, and really so much of the country as well. I mean, basically all 50 states, or close to all 50 states, are in this essentially like free spread of COVID, sort of, I'm forgetting what the CDC term is here, but it basically uncontrolled spread. That is to say, like beyond what the expectations were, the quote unquote highest risk, and unchecked community spread, I'm sorry, was the term there.
Right. There you go.
Yeah. And so it's just, I don't know, like hearing stories like that, it's truly sort of incredible, the level of recklessness that's going on. But I think what is frustrating the most is this kind of passing of the buck. I mean, it always starts with sort of these draconian governors, state legislatures like Texas, and of course Governor Greg Abbott here, who by executive order has forced open many of the businesses and likewise forced open many of the schools, with essentially the absolute bare minimum, plan set forth by the TEA, the Texas Education Association. There's essentially no kind of real plan. From my understanding, there's no real sort of way that you can prevent the spread of COVID in these classrooms. You can, wear masks, of course, but if some people aren't going to wear masks, that only does so much. And even so, we're seeing it spread anyway. We're seeing like essentially the that there's no, like, the idea that there are any kind of authorities, that the quote unquote adults in the room who are kind of making plans to prevent this spread, it's just not there. There's so little protection, so basic minimum even requirements here, because it's such a ridiculous idea that you can bring students into classrooms. I think I use the analogy of saying that they keep trying to reopen. They've essentially like normalized the reopening, normalized the fact that people keep going back to businesses. But it's sort of like saying there's this fire spreading, and when the fire gets low enough, when the fire is under 5% or whatnot, we're going to put a little bit of wood on the fire. We're going to send a few people back to work. We're going to send a few people back to schools,
Yeah.
but we're just going to put a little bit of wood on the fire so too many people don't get sick, and then we'll increase the amount of wood that goes in. Well, like what does that do? You're still like, when you put people in rooms together, you're increasing the chances. You're basically guaranteeing that COVID is going to make a comeback. And so essentially, I feel like, to wrap up a long rant here, we've seen on the one hand this
Rant
kind of
away.
yeah, we've seen this normalization of just everybody being sick and COVID being out of control on the one hand, of simply saying, well, this is how the fire is burning, with the goalposts always moving, so that what was completely unacceptable a couple weeks back is now totally cool. And then on the other, we're seeing this.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and then on the other end, we're seeing this kind of passing the buck, where sort of everybody's blaming the TEA, everybody's blaming Abbott. But the truth is, from what I've seen, it seems like school administrators, the kind of higher ups at every level here, are pointing fingers at each other, when any one of them could make the decision, could simply say, this is not acceptable. Like they could kind of blow the whistle on, I think, many of these practices behind the scenes that the public might not know about. And it just seems like that's not happening. It seems like I'm not seeing that from anybody.
Boy, Bree, you're just hitting it on the head right there. I mean, it really is. When we've seen in Austin only that 80% of families want to keep their kids home and safe and learning virtually, that is a daily survey, 100% filling out of that survey, that this is what we want as a community. You would think that the district would then address that and build the best system possible to keep people safe. But you don't have that. You have a district that will go so far as, I have a situation with a teaching assistant, a TA, that the responsibility of this TA, as a special ed TA, is a one-on-one with a student. That's her job. That student is learning virtually. They are insisting that TA come back into the building at least once a week to work from a room, isolated from everybody, and work virtually with that student. Why in the world do you bring someone into a space that has the potential of spreading the virus, when they could be in the safety of their home teaching virtually to the one-on-one assignment they have? It makes absolutely no sense. None whatsoever. The district could do so much more, because we came up with a plan in October that said, do an assessment of all your faculty and staff, the level of fear. Are they on accommodation, or would they be a second layer of accommodation? Are they perfectly comfortable coming back into the school? Now look at the number of kids you have on your campus. Figure out what you need and where you need them, and let everybody else teach virtually if they need to. Figure out creative ways to work on this. We tried from the very beginning of in-person instruction in October to do this. The district finally worked with us, and we got 6 campuses to pilot this at. I just met with the principals from these campuses about a week ago. They all reported they were able to find more accommodations for the teachers on campuses, and that they had built a positive culture of collaboration and working through a very difficult situation, but that they came out of it with greater trust and a greater working relationship. And at one campus, they were able to provide the 8 accommodations for teachers that had received an accommodation last fall, that had been denied in December, and were going to have to come back onto campus in January. But they were able to successfully find a way of getting those people back to virtual instruction. That's what we believe campuses can do if given the autonomy to work together. One size does not fit all. It goes against equity. It fights against the idea of accommodations in special ed and ADA accommodations in general. Everybody has a different situation. You build something around that person that fits their need, and not all of it's virtual. So this demand, that the idea of that TA was, Ken, I was told, we bring people back into school, and over a course of time, they get more comfortable. They know it's going to be okay, and then they're fine. And it's like, you've got to be kidding me. You're trying to make them to assimilate or dissipate their pain through assimilation into the board. Don't worry, just become part of it. You'll be fine. And you just assimilate away all of the pain and the fear. That's no way to go about bringing people back into schools. That regardless, if I keep hitting you over and over every day, it's not going to hurt so much. You're going to get used to it. And it's just that these are leaders of kids and of our grown-ups. It's appalling. Bree, it's just appalling. You just nailed it. It's exactly right.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to also kind of hit on kind of two other bits of the mythology here. I know a lot of school districts, I'm not sure how much AISD has relied on this, but I know that this has been a common sort of refrain, is that COVID within schools is not being spread in schools. It's coming from quote unquote community spread. Somehow there's this community spread of COVID that's supposedly separate from the schools. But it's like, I mean, schools are part of a community. They're a physical building within a physical neighborhood that people meet at regularly. I mean, how is a school not part of the quote unquote community? But then the other part of that is the science does not bear out that either children don't get COVID, or that schools aren't passing COVID, or that schools aren't, places where COVID is spreading. Yes, children overall receive more kind of mild COVID symptoms. They experience COVID more mildly overall, those who do. Some of them don't. But this simply means they're more likely to asymptomatically or semi-symptomatically spread this disease to their family members who suffer the full brunt of COVID. And I also, want to hit on this idea, this kind of social justice idea of like, well, we need to bring the failing students back in, or the quote unquote failing students. I hate that term. But it's essentially it often becomes sort of a metaphor for working class especially Black and brown students. We need to bring them back in so that they have better access, or else they're going to quote unquote fall behind more or whatnot. I mean, first of all, how you integrate people back into schools during this deadly pandemic and say we're forcing you back in and expect them to have better, test results or whatever the metric is there, is absolutely ridiculous. But then the other part of this is obvious that these working class Black and brown kids, their families have less access to healthcare. So if they were to get COVID during schools, any quote unquote progress they would have made by being in schools rather than receiving virtual learning is wiped away altogether, because their family may go into bankruptcy, their family may face serious repercussions, or somebody may just die, and that's certainly upsetting. That's certainly disruptive to education. And so, there's so much mythology here coming out about, like COVID from these school districts. This just absolutely on its face, absolute nonsense. The community spread, the idea that they're somehow concerned about social justice and whatnot for struggling students, etc., is just absolute, I think, nonsense on its surface. I'd also then, I know that's a lot to answer. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know. I think all you got to do is look at the rates. Yeah. When you have the Latinx community at 4 times positivity rates, where you have double death rates, and you have increased numbers within the Black community as opposed to the white community, to then demand that they go back into the schools and encourage them to go back is patently racist. It is absolutely the wrong approach, and it really flies in the face of the idea that we are for our Black and brown communities. Yes, there's going to be a drop. There's going to be a greater chasm in terms of accountability, in terms of learning, but that already existed in the Black and brown community before COVID. Let's not call COVID the one that's creating this spread or creating this loss of learning opportunities. We're living in a racist system that has racist public education systems that Black and brown kids are already behind because of that racism. So don't tell me that COVID's the demon. COVID is just here, and it's exposing it. So tell me what you're going to do now, but tell me what you're going to do after COVID to exacerbate or to lessen the gap. So I really struggle with folks that are doing this and that are trying to force folks back into a classroom, which is dangerous. The mythology early in the COVID pandemic was that kids really don't get COVID. And everybody was using that as a justification to keep schools running at some level or to bring kids back. Well, what did we find out? Well, my God, school age kids. I mean, that was the biggest spike over the last month. It's huge. So it's not. So let's not wait for the concrete realities of a frightening disease that can kill regardless of age. Let's do everything we can do that's preventative and keep doing that preventative, which speaks to your comment earlier. If it's working, the number one way to make sure spread isn't happening is by keeping people home. That's it. That keep people away from each other. That's the best way to do it. And the district keeps saying, well, our protocols, our masks and our hand washing. I want to see where the numbers are. I want to see the data where they can prove to me the mask and the hand washing, where that's anything scientific other than their hunch or their belief that they're doing a good work. The number one thing in the drop will be, or any drop, is that we're staying home. That's the number one way to keep the spread from occurring. So you're right. The schools are not separate from the communities. They are not silos. They are part of it. There's clearly community spread that occurs, and those schools are part of that community, and it needs to be respected that way and treated that way, not an isolated space.
Yeah, and I understand there's this frustration for people, like essentially, why is it taking so long? Why have we been in this a year, et cetera? And some people's response to that, I think, has been very much, well, it's like, if it's not going to end, it's time to send people back. If I need to work, like if I need to pay my rent, I need to work, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this desperation, I think, among working people. And so some of them are kind of looking for this, or looking for sort of any way out of this, anyway, back to not normalcy per se, but just being able to pay their rent, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And I want to stress that, when whatever other opinions people might have about China, whatever people kind of understand about China, when China found out that there was this virus spreading amongst a part of their population, they implemented very strict quarantine measures. They also put the weight of the government behind sort of keeping the markets afloat. They were essentially paying people to stay home. They were making sure that like people weren't falling behind on rent. They were taking care of the needs of their citizens on one hand. In Wuhan, you could also at one point kind of call the police, and they would deliver groceries to you as part of their service, not as a photo op, just as part of the service of like the police. At one point, they would deliver groceries to you. And so in effect, China was able to not only essentially eradicate the virus in Wuhan to the point where they're able to open back up, but they were also able to save their economy. China is the only economy in 2020 that's or I think coming into 2021, I forget. I think in 2020, China was the only economy that was able to sort of grow over the course of the year. China actually has a still net positive rate of GDP and whatnot. And that essentially, again, like whatever else people might think of China, that level of sort of coordination is what it is that we needed here, what it is that we could still have here if we had a government that was functional in any way whatsoever, or if we had corporations who weren't kind of forcing this down people's throats. And yet, because of these half measures, we're seeing just complete free flow of COVID. We're seeing complete lack of control because they're essentially they're trying to implement the half measure to quote unquote keep the economy open. But as I've used the metaphor already, like there's this fire burning and they keep half reopening things. Let's throw a little more wood on the fire, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it's clear they have no intention. Like they would rather just let this fire burn as long as it keeps the economy open. It's just absolutely frustrating. But I'd also like to kind of bring it back around in our last few minutes or so, and sort of like bring a positive sort of note to kind of once again show what a kind of fight back or what a sort of like struggle for better outcomes would look like. Yeah, what exactly has Education Austin been able to sort of accomplish, or what are sort of the next steps for Education Austin during this whole process?
Well, I appreciate that. Just as a quick kind of laundry list, when we first went into the pandemic and people were gone, the district wasn't going to pay workers to come in over their spring break and do all the cleanup. We were able to force and be able to add time and a half on top of their spring break pay. When they came in over the summer and had to do it the rest of school year in the summer, they were paid time and a half if they were on campuses and doing this frontline work. We made sure that people got paid through the end of the year. We made sure that we were able to push to see that we're meeting with the district regularly to see what the COVID numbers were so that we could have a safe reopening. We were able to push off, work with the Cruz administration to see that school started later, and then work into having 3 extra weeks before face-to-face, 3 weeks of virtual, so there's no face-to-face. And during that time that workers were paid that are 9-month or 10-month workers, and they wouldn't lose another 3 weeks of pay. We were able to secure and make sure that we had accommodations. There was 1,200 accommodations in this district. I think all of our efforts and the risk of and the threat of 1,000 teachers not showing up the day we came back on October 5th or 6th, I forget the date, pushed the district to do more and more accommodations so that scenario will happen. We've been able to organize people in a way that we haven't been able to organize before. We found through Zoom, we're pulling more and more people into community conversations. More of our members are coming together. In the process, able to have a very successful campaign or school board campaign where 3 of our endorsed candidates won. So that we have a more progressive voice on our school board. We've seen that we've been able to continue to apply pressure. We filed 127 grievances with the district on people that were denied accommodations after having been given accommodations. We don't know of any time in the district's history where anybody has presented that many. Matter of fact, our history of 22 years, we have not even filed 127 grievances. And we've seen relief from a majority of those so far that have gone to the first step or the first step 1 of the grievance. Some that have already come to agreements with their campuses before they even move forward. So the pressure is real, and the district is feeling it. We've been able to directly kind of use social media. The district's been unhappy with it at times, but we're perfectly happy. If they're going to do things in the last minute, put people in a terrible position, we're going to speak out, paint us into a corner, don't work with us. We're going to strike back, and we're going to strike back hard. And I don't think this administration understood that coming out of Dallas. We are a union, damn it. We're not going to just sit by and let workers be abused. Work with us on a better outcome. But if you're not going to work with us, we're going to work our own stuff. And we're going to defend our workers, our members, and stand up for them. And we believe not only does that impact our membership, it impacts all workers. And it shows that the union is here. There's nobody else doing this work in this district. Nobody else. And any other little club or association that's out there is just completely ineffective. And they're just kowtowing the district and administration and TEA. We're the only one in this district that's standing up to the district, to TEA, and saying no. And that we've got to do this. We've come up with creative ideas like the flexibility plan. So, the district never came up with themselves to keep people safe. So we're trying and going forward, we're just going to keep doing more of the same. We said at the very beginning, we will fall down on the safety sword. That will be our line, and we will keep people safe. It comes before education. People have to be safe to learn, and we'll continue to do it.
I think that's an absolute great place to wrap up. And I'll kind of once again stress a point I feel like I stress pretty often, which is, we're in just such an economic wreck right now. It's kind of in many ways, a permanent economic decline of the United States due to sort of the decline of its empire. We can go into that on other segments for sure, but I think it's I think it's important to say, to understand that if you want the sort of economic and financial security long term that all workers deserve, if you want to make sure you have a roof over your head, if you want to make sure you have a true retirement plan, if you want to make sure you're making kind of the money that is required, really live, like a true living wage rather than just a kind of survival or sub-survival wage, and job security along with that. The real best investment you can make is not the stock market. It's not these sort of gambling games that sort of the rich capitalist class always wants people to play. The best investment you can make is to join a union and to fight alongside other people in the union. So once again, so glad to be joined by Ken Zarifis, the president of Education Austin. Thank you very much, Ken, for coming on the show once again.
Thank you so much, Bree. It's always a pleasure. I just so appreciate this. Yes.
Always glad to have you on. Welcome back to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. I just want to remind people that People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. I am sorry about sort of the problems with me only being able to basically get one guest per episode and then having to syndicate some content here. I just want to say how appreciative I am of the many wonderful podcast producers and radio show producers who have allowed me to use bits of their show or entire segments of their show at various points. Not only has COVID kind of affected my production, but a lot of political organizing itself has gotten in the way. And I just have to prioritize a little bit of my time. Unlike many of your favorite content creators, I don't have kind of a production staff to kind of help me out. So I've been trying to do my best. I've been trying to get a lot of political projects off the ground. I think this is a good chance to really highlight some of the diversity of wonderful leftist programming out there, progressive programming out there, and specifically kind of socialist programming as well. So for this second half, I'm going to play a selection from a kind of daily podcast called The Punch Out with Eugene Puryear. It's sort of a daily socialist news roundup. I hope you're able to get a lot from this. Stay tuned. People's Republic will be back next week with more wonderful content as well. So, I appreciate Eugene Puryear, the crew over there at Breakthrough News. You can find more of their content at Breakthrough News, both video, audio, and more. This is the Punch Out.
Breakthrough. You are now listening to Breakthrough News. It's 5 p.m. You're listening to Breakthrough News, and this is the Punch Out. We're following the news all day so you don't have to, giving you everything you need to know about what's in the headlines and what should be. And yes, we are back here on the Punch Out on 1/25/21. 25th of January, 2021. Sorry, I had to check the date on that one. Man, the quarantine time is getting us all. Either way, happy to be back with you on this Monday. Hopefully you had a great weekend. Hopefully your day's going so well. And if not, hopefully we can improve it a little bit here with some crucial, important news as we always do on the Punch Out. We're going to be talking about protest in Russia over the weekend over Alexei Navalny and how he may not be exactly who the media is telling you he is. We're going to be talking about the serious death toll that climate change is already taking on many communities around the world. And before we get to those two important stories, we're going to go to the city of Chicago, the Windy City, where there's a major struggle breaking out over COVID-19 and public health, and unions are really standing on the ramparts, protecting students, families, and the community. And yes, that's right. The city of Chicago this morning backed away from a decision that they were going to bring back 10,000 teachers in a large-scale school reopening. They wanted the teachers to come back in preparation for what they claim is going to be many tens of thousands of students that are going to return in just a couple weeks more. And this was a huge issue, of course, because obviously COVID-19 continues to surge, and the union had been pointing out for the week leading up to this that it was totally unsafe to go back in this context, that the preparations had not been appropriately made, and that a couple weeks ago they forced special education teachers to do the same thing, and they were pointing out how that showed that, again, the preparations had not been made and there shouldn't be a widespread return unless there was appropriate COVID-19 precautions. Now, teachers are adamant that this is not a strike, so much so that late last week, large numbers of them taught online outside in the freezing Chicago winter to show their willingness to work, just not to submit students, their families, and school staff and their families to just unnecessary risk here. The city, however, is claiming it's a strike. Ultimately, they want to make it easier to retaliate against teachers speaking out for public health and to try to muddy the waters about what this is really about. Maybe it's about some other suspicious demand, some other greedy union thing, and it's not really about what they're saying, which is public health. But the union has made a few key points that have to be considered here and really should be the main ones. First, they were demanding that CDC guidelines be what the school system uses to reopen or for their reopening process, and the city refused that. They refused to use CDC guidelines. Second, the union notes that only 19% of students are set to return in person soon, and that means that the 10,000 staff the city is demanding return is too large. There's not that many. It's unnecessary. The union proposed a different plan, which was to start staffing schools as teachers become vaccinated. And by the way, in other places, they're vaccinating the teachers, pretty much first. In Chicago, they haven't even vaccinated the people who work for the school system who are eligible. That's as of Saturday. Nevertheless, what the union was proposing is that the teachers become vaccinated and that they then go back and that they scale up the staffing based on that and that they focus it mainly on those who are having the toughest time with online learning, working class students in Black and Latino communities. And so more or less you'd have a scaled reopening that would be very safe, that would be thinking about all these critical things with this new strain of the coronavirus is out there. And that also would be aimed towards, as capacity comes online in a limited way, going towards those who are the most vulnerable from the effects of poverty, quite frankly, and why they're unable to access the internet and other critical elements of that make online learning a thing. Either way, the city was completely against all those things, and now they have forced the teachers to, make this action and agree to work online, but not in schools. So, here we are in Chicago, 400,000 dead from the coronavirus so far in the United States, 400,000 dead. As I already mentioned, you got a new variant. It's spreading quicker. It could be more deadly, they're saying. We don't know that yet. And somehow, for some reason, the city of Chicago is trying to force tens of thousands of people back into enclosed spaces and moving around the city without much more than the most basic precautions. And as the union tells it, they're not even meeting that basic goal that they claim they are on paper, but instead are trying to blame teachers for caring enough about their community to raise their voices about unsafe practices. Now, they're claiming the school the school system, that is CPS, that they are going to push people to come back on Wednesday, and that essentially if you don't come back on Wednesday, you'll be locked out. That's what the real effect of it is, that they'll be locking out workers who refuse to participate in this public health disaster being perpetuated by the Chicago City Schools. However, they backed down today, and we will see if they back down again on Wednesday or meet the demands of the union, which are certainly eminently reasonable at a time where all of us are facing such serious peril. And a new analysis out there has sought to quantify how many people have been killed by extreme weather events linked to climate change in the last 20 years. In some ways, what's been a lot of the real human effect of climate change really bringing many of these different and more frequent extreme weather events to us. And what did they find? Well, they found that almost 500,000 people have died in almost 11,000 different extreme weather events that they tracked. And they noted that Puerto Rico, Myanmar, and Haiti were the hardest hit individual countries. And the particular number there is 480,000 dead. Again, 480,000 dead, 11,000 extreme weather events over the last 20 years, primarily in poor countries in the global south. And The author of this, one of the co-authors of this study, which was done by a think tank called German Watch, David Eckstein, noted exactly that about where the majority of the death toll was taking place. He said to Al Jazeera about the study that it shows, quote, that poor, vulnerable countries face particularly great challenges in dealing with the consequences of extreme weather events, end quote. And he went on to note that one key factor in why these deaths actually took place, not just because it was inevitable in terms of what was known about what has happened with climate change, but because the richer nations have failed to meet their burden, the $100 billion they promised in the Paris Climate Agreement that Biden is so happy about rejoining and re-signing, that they have failed to bring those tens of billions of dollars to the most vulnerable countries that are often also the poorest to adapt to the challenges that everyone knew was coming, and hundreds of thousands of people are dying because of it. And not to mention, the majority of the people dying in these vulnerable countries are not the people producing the emissions that are causing their deaths. Yet those responsible are not paying. Tropical storms, hurricanes, and cyclones are the biggest culprits here, and they have, I think we've all noticed, been happening much more frequently and with a higher overall intensity, and are expected to happen even more frequently. In fact, the number is expected to jump every time global temperatures warm a tenth of a degree. This all, of course, reflects the very real human toll of climate change. And it outlines as things are going right now, it's set to increase devastatingly. Ultimately, it's the drive to accumulate wealth that makes it so hard to uproot the fossil fuel industrial complex. And we owe it to those who have given their lives so far to start getting serious about capitalism's role in destroying the climate, all the sooner that we can be about the real business of saving it. Thousands of people were arrested at protests over the weekend in a range of cities in Russia, including the capital city of Moscow. The demonstrators were taking part in events in solidarity with the opposition figure Alexei Navalny, who was jailed recently when he returned to Russia from Germany after being poisoned, which he claims, and the Germans claim, was carried out by the Russian government. The Russian government is saying they did not do it. His supporters see his arrest on his return as a form of political persecution, and the government is saying that he was violating the terms of his parole from a previous embezzlement conviction, and that the protests themselves were illegal. Navalny always gets huge, massive media attention in the West and is widely held up to be the principal opposition figure to Russian President Vladimir Putin. They present, in the West that is, Navalny as, well, I mean, you know, like you and me, I guess, right? Just a progressive guy fighting the good fight. And it plays a big part of the media construction of the broader narrative in the West about the evil Russians. It's certainly an easier case to make when you have this clear hero good guy to counterpose the so-called bad guy to, which is what we see pretty consistently. And so, quite frankly, if you really want to understand what's going on, why you probably should understand a little bit more about who this guy Alexei Navalny is. Ultimately, he isn't the progressive person they're telling you he is, or that's how he tries to trick you into being, saying that, you know, he supports Bernie Sanders. I think he said something in favor of Black Lives Matter, but you got to look at the real record here. While he's mainly noted for his anti-corruption campaigning, he is also a noted campaigner against immigrants, making various calls for mass deportations. He told The Atlantic magazine in 2013 one of his major priorities was also cracking down on, quote, ethnically based organized crime groups, end quote. Never heard that one before. He once expressed support for a 2013 race riot. Yes, that's right. A 2013 race riot where skinheads attacked immigrants. And as one commentator put it, he has also, quote, made a series of racist statements about Muslims and people from the Caucasus and former Soviet republics in Central Asia. Navalny also isn't really as popular as he's made out to be. He's been polling at about 2% recently and has, as that would imply, a relatively narrow base of support. And whatever the inconsistencies in the Russian elections in and of itself, it's very clear that the extreme right-wing but very oddly named Liberal Democratic Party and the Communist Party are much more significant opposition forces. And in fact, Navalny has recently tried to burnish his reputation by backing their challengers in certain elections, which in the Western media turns into, oh, they only did well because Navalny backed them, when it's the other way around. And also, he's toned down his earlier neoliberal rhetoric, very free market, right-wing kind of guy economically as well. But to adapt a little bit more to these more popular opposition parties has been more in line with their more generous economic visions, as it were. Ultimately, the building up of Navalny The fact that you've probably heard so much about him, but none of what I just said is to put a positive spin on a bad policy. Opposing a new Cold War with Russia, which is where it seems all the major parties want to take us, isn't about loving Putin. It's about the most responsible way to move the world away from war and destruction, from an endless war drive, this constant enemy politics, rather than global cooperation, which we obviously need more now than ever, given what we just talked about with climate change. But either way, you can't have a war without propaganda. And the morality tale of Navalny versus Putin is designed to make you feel good about a set of policies that actually have nothing to do with freedom and democracy. In fact, the only thing that usually seems to come with them is increasing number of troops in Poland, more nuclear missiles, more giant bombers, and other high-tech boondoggles. So when they're building up all these things about who's who and what's what and who we have to take out, just consider some of what I told you here today. Well, Joe Biden, of course, campaigned, as did all Democrats in this year's primary, on a swift return to the Iran nuclear deal that Trump had exited. In his first days, though, the Biden administration seems to be backing away from any imminent return and, to a degree, raising doubts about their commitment to going forward with it at all. Avril Haines, who's the director of national intelligence, said about returning to the accord during her confirmation that, quote, "I think, frankly, we're a long way away from that." That same day, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said about the same issue, "We are a long way from there." Okay, well, not strong endorsement. And Haines also in her hearing raised the real poison pill issue of this whole thing, and that's about trying to amend the deal even further to restrict Iran's missile program, which is important to recognize also ultimately means limitations on civilian rocketry like satellites and the like. On Wednesday, Jen Psaki, she's the White House press secretary, stated that, quote, "Iran must resume compliance with significant nuclear constraints under the deal in order for that to proceed," more or less implying that the U.S. would not make the first move. But that is what Iran is requesting. Now, Iran has deliberately gone out of compliance in small ways with some parts of the deal, but they did it as a protest against the U.S. withdrawal from the deal and then putting on the maximum pressure campaign. And because the U.S. withdrawal shows that the U.S. just isn't an honest broker on these issues, Iran is saying that they want the U.S. to lift sanctions. And by the way, we're in the middle of a pandemic. They should be doing that regardless, but they're saying they want them to lift sanctions to show, hey, this is a good faith effort, and then they are 100% willing, they have said consistently, to re-enter the Iran deal. But from the very beginning, they've been saying that they have totally ruled out any additional restrictions on their ballistics program. So they're insisting on that issue, I should say, which is certainly popular among some Senate Democrats, and increasingly, it seems, amongst the European Union, almost certainly means that the deal will totally fall apart. Either way, the process seems to be frozen here at this point, despite, of course, some reports that are coming out recently that there are some secret talks going on. Iran is also slated this year to have presidential elections, and the mood for compromise in the electorate may be low, and candidates who favor policies of increased resistance with the West, rather than more collaboration and trying to appease them to have all these various deals, are expected to do relatively well and perhaps to capture the presidency. So ultimately, factors seem to be shaping up here that may not lead to a significant de-escalation between the U.S. and Iran. The U.S. insists on total domination of the region, and for policies that limit Iran's ability to grow economically. That's what it's really about, limiting Iran's ability to grow and to become more of a regional power. However you may feel about that, what right is it of the United States to decide who gets to rise and who gets to fall? But be that as it may, you put that together with the fact that people in Iran are just increasingly less willing to accept that. At least that's what it seems from the trends we were talking about with the election. So ultimately, it's the imperialist attitude that has to give way here, but there's really just no sign at all that that is going to happen from the Biden administration and perhaps on Iran. In the phrase that Joe Biden made famous in his speech, I guess you could say, to donors in the fall of 2019, maybe with Iran too, nothing will fundamentally change. In the LA County Jail, where there have already been over 4,000 cases of COVID-19, it turns out that they're holding more people in pretrial detention for longer. In the middle of a pandemic, people are being held in a COVID super spreader facility who have been convicted of no crime and are more likely to spend 6 months or more in jail than they would have been 1 year ago. Data from towards the end of last year shows that 41% of people held pretrial in LA County Jail were in jail for 6 months or longer, while at the beginning of the year, that number was 35%. So that's a 6% increase there. Research reflected that there were two main drivers for this issue. One was, one you could probably guess, that the courts were closed, leading cases to back up, which is, wow. This is pretrial detention. People who haven't been convicted of any crime. And you're crowding them more into jails and turning it into an even bigger super spreader site rather than just letting people go, again, who have been convicted of no crime. That is just brazenly criminal in and of itself. You create a mass public health risk just to avoid letting the facade of mass incarceration fall. And the risk is real. The research also showed that those being held over 6 months, 66% had underlying health conditions. 66% had underlying health conditions, and 88% had been placed in quarantine or isolation at some point. And the second major driver was the LA County Sheriff's Department doing a terrible job in COVID mitigation efforts, as the above numbers reflect. Just to be clear, that's no surprise. Just also today, the California Attorney General announced a civil rights investigation to the LA Sheriff's Department, which is, just ridden with brutality and racism and all sorts of criminal activity. But nevertheless, they aren't doing enough, and that's partially why you have those high numbers. And again, not only are these people being held pretrial, but the reason they're being held pretrial is primarily they can't afford the cash bail. So amidst everything else, they're basically jailed for being poor. It's really a powerful statement about not only the deep brutality and injustice of the U.S. prison system, but how both parties are complicit when things like this are happening even in quote-unquote deep blue California. Well, if you eat chicken or meat in general, or just generally hate how capitalist monopolies make life harder for working class people, I've got a story for you. This week, Tyson Foods, one of the giants of the $65 billion chicken industry and the rest of the meatpacking industry, has just paid $221.5 million to settle a massive 4-year legal case alleging major price fixing. In a way, they got off easy because they didn't have to admit fault. They just had to pay the money. But clearly, they're settling because they didn't think they could win in court. Tyson, as well as Pilgrim's Pride, still face even more of these lawsuits, some from huge companies like Walmart and Chick-fil-A. JBS SA, which is the parent company of Pilgrim's Pride, settled a similar case last year in the pork industry. That was early December. And they also turned state's evidence against Tyson and Hormel, who are also under investigation for price fixing in or similar sorts of activities in the pork industry. In the case settled this week, the issue at play is monopoly. What is being alleged is that Tyson and a small number of huge companies that dominate the meatpacking industry are colluding with one another to coordinate their production and their pricing to increase the prices on the buyers, which of course increases their profits, but it also means increased costs for you at the restaurant or at the grocery store. 5 companies control more than 60% of the chicken market. 4 companies process over 80% of American beef. 3 companies control 63% of the nation's hog processing. And some of those are the same companies. So the level of monopoly is extremely high, and the ability to collude, obviously, is also quite easy. And it's also because this can be done in sort of stealthy type ways. There's something known as price leadership in business parlance. We can't get into the whole thing here, but basically it's when you have a few companies and it's hard to get in, the high cost of entry, so that you're not going to have a lot of new people entering easily. You can send implicit signals to bigger firms, which just sort of signal what the right price to fix is. And even that sort of implicit signaling can be illegal in certain circumstances, but you can see it's a very fine line between, well, we're producing kind of the same product and it costs more or less the same, and, outright collusion to make the prices higher. So it's hard to prove in court, and that's a lot of times why they get away with it for years and years and years, because people know they will, to be difficult to win. So ultimately what it really means is that built into the way the economy operates, because this is in all monopolized industries, but, here we're talking about food, built into the way it operates under capitalism is higher prices for you and higher profits for these big, huge corporations. It's just built in. It's a feature, not a bug. It's not even necessarily illegal in every case. And even when it isn't really being prosecuted heavily. And at the most, people people are paying these big fines and, quite frankly, going back to doing something roughly what they were doing before. It's just the cost of doing business for these big monopolies. So think about that now in the time of a pandemic where there are millions of people in this country, tens of millions of people struggling to afford food, and the big corporations are colluding behind their back to raise the prices of the things they need to survive. That's capitalism for you, American style and everywhere else.
That was a selection from the Punch Out with Eugene Puryear, one of the shows that I have kind of syndicated in addition to my own show. I was only able, once again, to produce half an hour of content. Some of that is because, for instance, or a couple weeks back, one of the correspondents I was planning on bringing in had gotten sick. There was 1 week where sadly I'd had to put my dog down. And this week, just due to time constraints with my other political organizing, I was unable to put together a full show. So this is essentially was the second half of that. Once again, appreciate Eugene Puryear and the other wonderful, both organizers and podcast and radio producers who have allowed me to use some of their syndicated content. We will return with a full show as soon as we are able. So thank you all for being patient with me during obviously a time that's also kind of trying me to my limit as well. And hope you enjoyed. This is, of course, People's Republic. I am Brianna Griffith, and I will catch you next week. That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Thanks for tuning in as we report from the front lines of the struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.